The summer of 1863 was not exactly great for the Confederacy in the Civil War. In the East, at the Battle of Gettysburg from July 1st to July 3rd, the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee suffered a devastating loss at the hands of the Army of the Potomac. And in the West, Ulysses S. Grant had finally broken the siege at Vicksburg. And those two events made huge headlines, and we all know about them today. But there was an event that happened in between those two at the same time that has kind of been lost in the shuffle. And that is the Great Raid of John Hunt Morgan. Now, there are some people who may be familiar with John Hunt Morgan, and maybe some people who aren't. John Hunt Morgan was a Confederate cavalry commander who, in 1863, was under the command of Braxton Bragg in the Army of the Tennessee. Braxton Bragg was a Confederate general who I would consider to be the worst general with the best eyebrows. And leading up to the summer of 1863, you had Ambrose Burnside and the newly formed Army of the Ohio that had formed up, and there was a threat or a concern that the Army of the Ohio could be moving down into East Tennessee. So John Hunt Morgan proposed a raid into Union territory with 2 brigades of Confederate cavalry. You're looking at about 2,500 men and 4 artillery pieces. And what he wanted to do was move up through Kentucky and basically try and tie down the Army of the Ohio and also disrupt supply lines, disrupt communications. This was approved, but Braxton Bragg said that the one thing he didn't want John Hunt Morgan and his raiders to do was cross this river right here, the Ohio River. So on July the 2nd, while the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia were slugging it out in Gettysburg at places like the Peach Orchard and Devil's Den and Little Round Top, well, John Hunt Morgan and his 2 brigades of Confederate cavalry crossed the Cumberland River and had made their way into enemy territory. And over the next couple of days, they would be fighting some battles throughout Kentucky as they were making their way through Union territory. And in one of those engagements, well, John Hunt Morgan's own brother was killed. And by July the 7th, they made their way right up here to where I am now in Brandenburg, Kentucky. And we are looking at, of course, the Ohio River right here. There was a ferry that went across here called the Brandenburg Ferry. And it's right here where Morgan is going to disobey his orders. And he is going to cross and go into Indiana. And as you can see, there's been some flooding here recently. Got a bunch of nasty mud. But they have a historic marker right here at the old Brandenburg Ferry that talks about Morgan's raid. Here it says, on July 7th, 1863, Morgan's CSA cavalry arrived here, captured steamers John B. McCombs and Alice Dean. Next day, they began crossing the river. Indiana militia fired on them but fled under return fire. Alice Dean burned after crossing. Morgan went on to northeastern Ohio, where he surrendered July 26th. Imprisoned at Columbus, Ohio, where he escaped November 24th and returned south. And, oh yeah, I got right into some of that mud while I was reading that. So the Alice Dean as it says there on that historic marker, is going to be burned after it crosses the river. The other one, the Macombs, ended up being spared because Basil Duke, one of the brigade commanders, who was also a brother-in-law of John Hunt Morgan, was friends with the captain. So that steamer got spared. We are going to cross the Ohio in just a moment and follow in the path of Morgan's raiders as they moved north. But first, I wanted to come up here on this high point and take a look at this Confederate monument. Now, the Confederate monument that you see here was not originally in Brandenburg. This was originally in Louisville, Kentucky. And the history behind it is honestly kind of fascinating, at least it is to me. So in 1881, there were 6 women who formed a group called the Kentucky Women's Confederate Monument Association. And among that group was a woman named Henrietta Morgan Duke. Henrietta was the sister of General John Hunt Morgan, who crossed here at Brandenburg on this longest cavalry raid of the Civil War. His second in command, Basil Duke, as I mentioned earlier, was part of that group and ended up marrying Henrietta. Okay, well, years later, they decided to erect a monument. It was in Louisville, Kentucky. They acquired some land there in Louisville and had fundraisers where they sold signed copies of Jefferson Davis's photo, and they had bake sales and all kinds of things like that. And then in 1895, they laid the cornerstone, and then they put in the foundation a time capsule that had some Confederate currency and newspapers and a cigar that Jefferson Davis had allegedly smoked. There were some photos of Davis and Robert E. Lee that were placed in there as well. Basil Duke spoke at the ceremony dedicating the monument. Well, in 2016, there was some controversy over the presence of that Confederate memorial. The Confederate monuments have been kind of a little bit of a sore spot in recent years. So the decision was made to move the Confederate monument right here to the crossing point for Morgan's raiders in Brandenburg. And they also moved the time capsule as well. And all around the monument, they have information markers and things like that talk about the history of the Civil War, and I think it does a good job, and also talks about the history of the monument. And I don't want to wade too deep into the Confederate monument controversy, but I think that that's a good way to treat these Confederate memorials. Maybe not necessarily to tear them down. There were different reasons why they were erected in the first place. In some cases, it was out of hostility to African American populations. In some cases, it was just to remember the Confederate dead. But what they've done here is good, where they provide interpretation. Because, right or wrong, the Confederate memorials and the monumentation of the Confederates is part of history and something that we can learn from. And then also here they have some different murals that talk about the history of Brandenburg. Okay, so right here we see the Alice Dean. Okay, so that was the steamer that got burned on the other side of the river. And then also here in their interpretation, they have John Hunt Morgan's raiders coming into the town of Brandenburg, 10 a.m. July 7th of 1863. And then there on the left, right here, is Basil Duke. Okay, so again, when we're talking about the Civil War, one thing that I'll want to make clear as far as my stance is, that the Confederacy was on the wrong side of history, but there are things that we can learn from that, and also things that we can learn from the era of monumentation in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So yeah, they do a good job here. Just one other short thing when talking about the contemporary controversy over Confederate monuments. One thing that I've seen done in other sites that I really like is that in addition to the Confederate monument remaining in place, other monuments are also placed in the area that help tell a broader story of the Civil War. So right here in this spot, this was not only the crossing point for Morgan's Raiders, this was also a crossing point on the Underground Railroad. Kentucky was a slave state, Indiana was a free state, so this spot along the Ohio was where a lot of slaves who were escaping and seeking their freedom crossed. So there is a statue and a memorial to honor the memory of those who came through here on the Underground Railroad. Unfortunately, because of the flooding, it's inaccessible. I don't know where it's at. I can't find it. Everything is underwater and muddy right now. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and cross the Ohio now and start making our way north in the path of Morgan's Raiders. Now, after crossing the Ohio River, Morgan's Raiders would have made their way up to the spot where I am now, which is just south of the town of Corydon. And you've got a bunch of Kentucky regiments. There was one Tennessee regiment with Morgan's Raiders, the 9th Tennessee. And as they approached Corydon, well, right here along what is known now as Battle Line Ridge was waiting the 6th Regiment of the Indiana Legion under the command of a guy named Lewis Jordan. Here along the ridge where the Battle of Corydon took place, they have a kind of a memorial battle park that has some interpretation and also has a few interesting artifacts. So as you were walking into this area, one of the first things that catches your eye is this. This is the mooring post and anchor chain that was recovered from the Alice Dean steamer. Of course, and it says here that was sunk by General Morgan after crossing the Ohio River on July 8th of 1863. Yeah, that's kind of cool. So right now I am facing to the north, so we are looking at the Union lines from the Confederate point of view. And on the morning of the 9th, well, you would have had about 400 to 450 men from the Indiana Legion who would have had a battle line stretched right through this area here, and they would have built up breastworks, so they would have had logs and stones stacked up to prepare for Morgan's Raiders as they were moving north. And right here, I think we're kind of in the middle of the line. So from this position right here, this is where like the 10th Kentucky and the 5th Kentucky and the 8th Kentucky would have assaulted the lines. And at about 11 a.m., elements of Morgan's Raiders would have made their first assault on this line. And it was pushed, the guys here in the Indiana Legion were able to hold them back. There was a second assault from the Confederates that also failed. One veteran of the battle from the Union side said that they were at a slight disadvantage because they couldn't see very far. As a matter of fact, if you look out over here, you'll notice that the ground drops and then rises right back up. So they don't have a very commanding view from this spot. Their field of view is really kind of limited. So once the Raiders got to them, I mean, they were like right on them. Well, at around 1 p.m., the Raiders would launch their third assault. And by that time, they were able to bring their artillery to bear. And another one of the veterans of this battle from the Union side described it as an ugly kind of music. So what we are looking at here is an artillery piece that is not one that was used here at the battle, but one that is quite similar. Just kind of a light artillery piece that Morgan's Raiders would have brought with them. As you continue walking along the ridge here in this park, one of the things that you will see is this monument. This one on this side says to Morgan's Confederate dead, and then lists 3 of the known dead in this battle. Again, this is from a force of about 22 to 2,400-ish. There had been an element that had broken away and went up around Louisville to try and draw Union forces away. But anyway, you can see Private Green Bottomer, John Dunn, Albert Womack, 8 unknown dead, and 40 wounded. And then if we circle around to this side, well, we see listed, it says July 8th and 9th, 1863, Home Guard and citizen dead. James Current, Ferry, Glenn, Heath, Lang, McKenzie, Nance, Steepleton, and 4 wounded. Okay, and this is, again, out of a force of about 400 to 450. All right, we have moved out of the battlefield park, and we've shifted over a little bit to the west. Now, for the Indiana Legion, their battle line would have been approximately 2,000 yards long, would have been anchored on either side by a couple of roads. And I'm right here on the far right flank, or what would have been the far right flank of the Union line. This was held by a group called the Ellsworth Rifles, who were under the command of a guy by the name of Major Thomas McGrain. Again, just to orient you as to where we are on the far right flank of the Union line. We are facing to the south right now, so you've got Morgan's Raiders who are advancing from this position. Off to my right, or to our west, is a little stream called Little Indian Creek. And then if we look off to the east here, well, right over here in this patch of woods, that's where we just were at the battlefield park. So the line of battle is going to come approximately right through here along this ridge. And after a couple of unsuccessful attempts charging the Union line, the Confederates are going to do a couple of things. One, they're going to bring their artillery to bear, and also they are going to outflank the Indiana Legion on both sides. So right through here, you would have had the 9th Tennessee that would have been coming right up in here and circling around. This was the only Tennessee regiment in Morgan's Raiders. The rest of them were from Kentucky. And the inexperienced Indiana Legion just crumbled, to be honest with you. There was one Union soldier by the name of Levi Staffer who wrote about his capture. He said, "When we were ordered to lay down our arms, I was standing on the bank of Little Indian Creek," which is, again, off to my west. "The water was about 2 feet deep and very muddy. I just dropped my gun into the creek. I found it there at 10 o'clock the next morning. Our guns were scarcely out of our hands when 2 or 3 villainous-looking wretches began exploring our pockets. I was not in a very pleasant humor, and I resented this indignity in terms more personal than any civil code would sanction, and in languages not found in the Bible." All right, well, there you go. That was a little bit on the Battle of Corydon, the only Civil War battle that was fought in the state of Indiana. I said at the beginning of this video that 1863, the summer of 1863, Vicksburg and Gettysburg get a whole lot of attention. I would encourage you, if you don't know much about it already, go learn more about Morgan's raid, because it would continue through Indiana and up into Ohio after this battle. But yeah, very fascinating site.